Alright, hi everybody. We're going to go through some accounting for the banking system and individual banks. So really important distinction. Banking system versus individual bank. Right, so the banking system versus the individual bank. I'll make this really clear as I go through it. I'll tell you when we're dealing with an individual bank or the banking system and the implications that that has. So first off, let's look at a bank. So there's a reserve ratio of 10%. So if I write RR and it's a percentage, that means that's the reserve ratio. If it's a number, that means it's the required reserves. So what I mean by that is that here, the reserve ratio is telling us the percentage of a deposit that the bank has to hold on to. So let's consider a bank. We have assets, liabilities, plus owner's equity. And for this bank, say that they get a deposit of $100. So demand deposits. These are deposits, i.e. The bank owes this to people. So you put your money into the bank, you then have a demand deposit of 100. The bank has $100 in cash. But this is cash, but we don't want the bank to actually be able to use all of it. A bank exists to make loans, right? They try to lend out money, and that's how they make money, is by charging interest on that. So they'd like to lend this out. But we put a reserve ratio in there. So a reserve ratio tells us the percentage of this deposit that the bank has to hold on to. So 100 comes in, and instead of recording it all as cash, we put some into required reserves, some into excess reserves. So 10% of this goes into required reserves, so that's 10. The rest is excess, so that's 90. So we record this as required reserves of 10, excess reserves of 90. So we've now done the deposit for this bank. Let's think about how much this bank can lend out. Well, they can't lend out the required reserves. That's money that they have to hold on to. These excess reserves is cash that they have that they can do whatever they want with. So if they want, they could buy securities or bonds, they could lend it out. So let's say that they lend it out. And note, they can lend excess reserves. So whenever I ask you how much can a bank lend, it's always their excess reserves. That's how much they could lend. So say that they lend the maximum. So here they lend 90. How are we going to model this? Well, if we're lending out 90, that doesn't change our demand deposits, right? No one's made a deposit or withdrawn their deposit. Required reserves. That's 10% of these demand deposits, so it's just 10. They lent out 90, so our excess reserves, we had 90 to lend out, we lent it out, now we have nothing left. Notice we don't balance. This 90 went somewhere, we loaned it out. So we have loans of 90. And notice that now we balance. So this individual bank, I might ask how much can they lend out? It's their excess reserves. They have no more excess reserves, so they can't lend anything out. So for the individual bank, it stops here. This is the maximum that an individual bank can lend out. But let's think about the banking system. This $90 was taken out as a loan. Notice the money creation, so money supply. So here the money supply increased by 90, right? So this is an increase of 90 because there only was $100. Now that same person has the $100. Someone else took out a loan for 90. So someone has 100, someone else has 90. So now the total money supply is 100 plus 90. So we've added 90. So far the change in the money supply is 90. We went from 100 to 190 when we made that loan. All right, so we have this loan that's been made. The individual bank can't do anything more, but the banking system can. So here the banking system What's going to happen if this gets redeposited into the banking system? Someone took out a loan, they likely did so because they wanted to buy something. Once they buy it, they then deposit it. So someone took out this loan, gave the money to someone else, and that someone else put it into their bank. Now, it may not be the same bank, it may be a different bank. So let's say that it goes into some other bank. So here there's a deposit of 90. So deposit of 90. So we have our demand deposits here, that's going to be 90. Right, this 90 comes in, we have reserve requirements, excess reserves. This is going to be 9, this is going to be 81, right? So 10% goes into other way. 10% goes into required reserves, that's 9. The 81 goes into excess reserves. So we now have required reserves here. 10% of this, which is 9. Excess reserves, so that other 81. How much can this bank lend out? They can lend 81, that's their excess reserves. Notice that it's 10% less than was loaned out before. So now the change in the money supply, when they lend it out, will be that plus 81. This bank can lend it out. Let's just model this and suppose that it gets lent out. Let's draw that real quick. We have demand deposits of 90, required reserves of 9. Excess reserves, what are these now? Well, we lent out the 81 that we did have, so now this is going to be 0. And we have loans. Here we lent out 81, so our loans are 81. What if this then gets redeposited back into the bank? How do we record that? We have demand deposits. So if we're depositing 81, we had this 90, we now add 81 to it, so we're up to 171. What about our required reserves? Well, from here we can tell this is going to be 17.1. How can we get that? Or what are our excess reserves at this point? Some people try to use the trick of demand deposits minus required reserves equals excess reserves. That is not always true. In fact, here it is not. So here, notice we had 81 come in. We have excess reserves, required reserves. We have 8.1 here. So here, that means we're left with how much? 72.9. So here our excess reserves are going to be 72.9. We had loans of 81, so we have the 81 in there. Here we get 73 to 90, 81, that brings us to 171 and 171, so we balance. So here this is our loans. So we now have loans of 81, excess reserves of 72.9, required reserves of 171.1, demand deposits of 171. So here, if we were to lend this out, how much can they lend? It's their excess reserves. So they can lend out 72.9. That's the most that that bank can lend out. That then gets deposited. 10% of that goes into required reserves. The other 90% can be lent out. This process continues on. How are we going to add up all of this? We use what we call the money multiplier. So MM is the money multiplier. That's 1 over the reserve ratio. Here it's 1 over 0.1, which is 10. So our money supply is 100 times 10, giving us 1,000. Something to note about this: the change in the money supply is 1,000 minus 100 equals 900. So we started with 100, we got to 1,000. So we went from 100 to 1,000, that change is 900. So that's the change in the money supply. And that's assuming that all of this is lent out, that people want to take out loans, that the bank wants to make loans. This is the maximum that the banking system can do. Alright, so this is the process of a bank lending out money from a deposit compared to what happens with the banking system when they lend it out. Again, the key difference, with an individual bank, once they lend out their excess reserves, it goes away and it might go into a different bank. So we look at the banking system and say, that money's been redeposited into some bank, which can then put some in their required reserves, the rest in excess reserves, and start lending that out again. We get this lending process, which changes the money supply. Note that change in the money supply, the change, is the amount of loans that could be created. So if you were to have a question, say for example, your reserve requirement is 20%. $500 is deposited. How much can a bank lend? So here we mean individual. How much can the banking system lend? So first off, that individual bank. So what we have is $500 comes in. How much is excess reserves? How much is required reserves? The reserve requirement is 20%. So you take 20% of this, that's going to give you 100. The other 400 must be excess reserves. So that's our answer, 400. That's how much the individual bank can lend out. If we were to draw this in a chart, assets, liabilities plus owner's equity, we have demand deposits of 500. Required reserves, 100. Again, through this process, excess reserves of 400. We can then lend it out. Say we lend out all 400. We end up with demand deposits, those stay the same. Required reserves, still 100. That's 20% here. Excess reserves. We've now lent out all of our excess reserves, so we have none left. But we have loans remaining, 400 in loans. So that's for an individual bank. What if we were to look at the banking system? So for the banking system, we use the money multiplier. What is our money multiplier? 1 over RR. That gives us 1 over 0.2, which is 5. So here if we want to know how much can they lend, we can do so one trick is to use our excess reserves, our original excess reserves. It gives us 400 times 5, giving us 2,000. Another way that you can see that is we started with 500. We use the money multiplier times that gives us 2,500. But we subtract off the 500 we started with, giving us 2,000. So if you want to jump straight to this 2,000, you can just multiply by your original excess reserves. That's the same thing as subtracting off the amount that you started with. All right, so here we see that they can make 2,000 in loans because this is the banking system. Therefore, we use the money multiplier. Let me show you some tricks that we can do with the money or with the reserve ratio. Say, for example, I have some bank, and I have demand deposits of 1,000, required reserves of 100, excess reserves 600. Let's say securities. Now we haven't seen those come up yet, but we will shortly. So we have 300 here, so we balance. This really could be anything. This could be cats. It's any asset that we have. It's an asset and it just doesn't affect the rest of this. All right, so we have 600 in excess reserves. Something to note, how much can we loan out? 600 as an individual bank. What if we want to know how much the banking system can lend out? Well, first we have to find the reserve ratio. How can we find that? I didn't give it to you. We can see here the ratio between these is 10%. Our required reserves are 10% of our demand deposits, therefore the reserve ratio is 10%. Therefore, our money multiplier is 10, so we can take our excess reserves, say how much can we loan out? It's going to be 600 plus, what is that, 540 plus etc. We just take off 10% every time. This is really just a math trick to add up all of these numbers. That's going to be 600 times 10, which gives us 6,000 can be made in loans. That's also, recall, the change in the money supply. All right, so that trick is kind of a good one. So saying, here's our reserve ratio, or our required reserves, here's our demand deposits, we can get the reserve ratio out of that. Something a student came up with recently, kind of a fun one. Say we have a money multiplier of 5. What's the reserve ratio? Well, here, our money multiplier is 1 over the reserve ratio, that's 5. Therefore, this is going to be a reserve ratio of 0.2. So make sure that you can do all of these. You want to be able to go back and forth with these pretty comfortably. Alright, note, just to check your algebra, 1 over 5, so we divide by 5, that equals r, we're going to multiply it. So we get 1/5, and that's 20%. Alright, so we've looked at the reserve ratio. Something to notice, the Fed could change, we use delta for change, the reserve ratio. So what if they change it? So suppose we have one bank with a reserve ratio of 10%, and they have demand deposits of 100. Therefore, they must have required reserves of 10, excess reserves, let's say they have all 90 there. So, how much can the banking system lend out? The banking system can lend out 90 times our money multiplier. Here we've seen this before, it's 10%, giving us a money multiplier of 10, so we have 900. What if the Fed were to change this and give us a reserve ratio of 20%? Well, then we would have demand deposits of 100. Our reserve ratio must be, so it was 10, now it's going to be 20. So our required reserves must be 20. Where are we going to get that from? Well, we'll have to take it from our excess reserves. We had money we could do whatever we want with. Well, now we have to put more into required reserves, so we take that from excess reserves. So excess reserves are now 80. How much can we lend out? Well, here we have fewer excess reserves, so it's 80. So that's going to bring this down a little bit. But a much larger effect comes from every bank having to hold on to a larger percentage of the money that's deposited. Our money multiplier, this year, 1 over 0.2 gives us 5. So here we have 400. Notice by changing this, the Fed can bring down the potential change in the money supply by 500. Basically, we can view this as a decrease in the money supply. Now, what if they were to do something even more extreme, such as a reserve ratio of 50%? A reserve ratio of 50%, let's look at what that does. Demand deposits of 100, required reserves, that's going to be 50, excess reserves, 50. So we have 50. Again, this bank now can loan out 50. The banking system can lend out 1 over 0.5, giving us 2, which is 100. So that's now the potential change in the money supply, i.e. it's the amount that this bank, or that the banking system can lend out in total. Alright, so here we've seen the Fed using one of their tools of monetary policy, the reserve ratio. Let's look at another one of the Fed's tools. Buying and selling bonds. So the Fed could sell bonds. Now the way that I like to think about this is to relate this in terms of what's happening to the bank. So we have some bank. So they have demand deposits of 1,000, required reserves of 200. What's our reserve ratio? 20%. All right, so now we have excess reserves. Let's say we have all excess reserves, 800. So we balance. What happens if the Fed chooses to sell these bonds? That means that the bank is buying bonds. So the bank's going to buy those bonds. When they buy the bonds, the bank gets bonds. So the bank buys the bonds. They use their excess reserves for that. So say the Fed sells 500 in bonds. Here I'll call them securities. So the Fed's going to sell them to the bank. That doesn't change the bank's demand deposits. Therefore, it doesn't change the required reserves. What does happen though, we had these excess reserves, we had 800. We're going to use that money now to give to the government, so we're giving it to the Fed. So this is going to decrease by 500 because that's how much we're spending, so that brings us down to 300. The Fed is going to give us these 500 in bonds. I'll call them securities. 500. Note that we balance. We could have lent out 800 before. Now we can lend out 300. The change is even larger when we consider the banking system, going from 8,000 or 4,000 down to 1,500. So we have a pretty substantial change in the potential money supply due to the Fed choosing to sell bonds. Note that the Fed could also buy bonds. So the Fed buys 200 in bonds. Let's model that. So we're going to take the same bank. Demand deposits won't change. Required reserves, again, still the same. Excess reserves and securities. Let's look at what happens here. So for our excess reserves, the Fed is going to buy bonds from us, so the bank is going to sell these bonds. If they're selling bonds, they're getting money. When they get the money, that's going to add it here. So we had 300, we sell some bonds, get another 200, bringing us up to 500 in excess reserves. So when we get the money, that's now money that we can lend out. So notice we can lend more money than we could before. How about our securities? We had 500. The Fed just bought 200, so now we're down to 300, and note that we do balance. So this is an example of the Fed buying securities or buying bonds, and that affects how much a bank can lend out. If the Fed's trying to use expansionary policy, they're going to buy bonds because it increases excess reserves. If it increases excess reserves, it's going to increase the amount of money that's available, driving down interest rates, increasing how much people consume. If they're using contractionary policy, if they're trying to pull back on inflation because it's too high, they're going to sell bonds. If they sell bonds, that will reduce the amount of excess reserves that a bank has, reducing how much can be lent out, reducing the money supply, increasing interest rates, and people won't borrow as much. So here we've looked at tools that the Fed can use. We've looked at how to record different transactions related to those changes. We've compared the difference between an individual bank and the banking system when it comes to the potential change in the money supply, i.e. how much money can be lent out.